Greetings from RPG Mods Fan. I have not voiced and given my opinions on the recent Wizards of the Coast OGL debacle, mainly because I had to move and ended up moving to a new city which, for various reasons, consumed a lot of my time. Given that Wizards of the Coast has pretty much capitulated, I admit this video is a little late to the discussion. Anyway, to put it simply, I think what Wizards of the Coast initially did and was trying to do was a boneheaded move. As a side note, because of the Wizards of the Coast OGL debacle, I think I should stop reviewing D&D material for this channel and switch to reviewing third-party RPG material. However, before the debacle, I already made a few D&D videos and uploaded them to YouTube, including my upcoming walkthrough of the B6 The Veiled Society module. They are scheduled to be released over the next few weeks, so oops. I understand that Wizards of the Coast was trying to increase their revenue and profits from their Dungeons & Dragons IP. However, they got too aggressive and too greedy. When I say they, I mean the executives at Wizards of the Coast and at Hasbro. When I refer to Wizards of the Coast, I am referring to their executives and not their staff. By all accounts, I am hearing the Wizards staff were against the OGL 1.1. Would I have tried to push through OGL 1.1 if I were in charge? My answer is no. In fact, back in November of 2021, on their job listings, Wizards of the Coast posted my dream job position of VP of D&D. On this channel, I have created a video on what I would do if I were the VP of D&D. So, please check out that video when you get the chance. Link to it will be in the description section below. In my video, I do not even talk about or mention the original OGL 1.0a. In other words, I would have not touched, modified, or have revoked it. That video proves that I am not talking with 2020 hindsight. What I find most controversial with what Wizards of the Coast tried to get away with in their changes to the OGL are the following. Number 1, they tried to revoke the original OGL 1.0a. The original OGL allows third parties to create written products such as adventures or rulebooks using the D&D system. By revoking it, Wizards of the Coast was trying to shut down the competition. In YouTube, collaboration between channels is more powerful than channels trying to badmouth each other. That is how Wizards of the Coast should see its so-called competition. They are more like collaborators instead of as competition. Number 2, they tried to steal other creators' works. They wanted the royalty-free and license-free right to use other people's work in their future publications without compensating or even giving credit to the original creators. In a later update, Wizards responded that stealing other creators' work was not their intent and that, quote, never crossed our minds, unquote. That reeks of bullshit to me. Number 3, they wanted to collect royalties from its competitors. Initially, the royalties were set for earnings above $750,000. However, who says they will not lower that threshold in the future? Also, in terms of what Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro makes, earnings from these royalties relatively would have not amounted to much. Hence, Wizards of the Coast's real goal was to shut down or, in the least, burden its competition. Number 4. They blocked any reasonable recourse third parties would have. They wanted to terminate licenses within a 30-day notice period for any reason of their own choosing. They wanted any lawsuits to be filed individually instead of as a collective. They wanted all such cases to be heard in the Washington state's court system. They wanted such cases handled via arbitration instead of via jury trial. Number 5. They wanted to be notified about and receive a report on the earnings of all monetized D&D content. What the f*** is Wizards of the Coast trying to act like the IRS? This sounds like something out of a bad dystopian future science fiction movie, which I feel we are living in right now. Using the Unreal Engine, Wizards of the Coast are trying to develop their own virtual tabletop, or VTT for short, for D&D. With this VTT, the underlying and real goal of the executives at Wizards of the Coast and of Hasbro was to turn D&D into a microtransaction and loot box-filled video-like game. The first step was to eliminate, or in the least, limit the competition, which the adaptation of the OGL 1.1 would have achieved. Basically, Wizards of the Coast's sin was to treat D&D like a video game and try to monetize it in the worst ways possible, with microtransactions and loot boxes. In trying to save face with their OGL debacle, Wizards of the Coast told so many bold-faced lies and insulted its fans and customers. They falsely claimed that OGL 1.1 was only a leaked draft, saying that their intention was to prevent third parties from minting D&D NFTs and large businesses to exploit their intellectual property. Basically, they were trying to deflect and lie about their real intentions, saying their goal was to stop, quote, racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, bigoted, or otherwise discriminatory, unquote, content is another bold-faced lie to deflect their real intentions. In their updates on the OGL post, Wizards of the Coast stated, quote, "You're going to hear people say that they won and we lost because making your voices heard forced us to change our plans. Those people are only half right. They won and so did we," unquote. How childish do you have to be to add this quote? Basically, the D&D community saw through the executives' bold-faced lies. There is so much more I can say, but because I am not an attorney, I have to stop here and say that everything said in this video are my opinions only. Again, referring back to my VP of D&D video, on the screen are the 5 things I would have done if I were the VP of D&D. With item number 2, Wizards of the Coast did not properly seek feedback from the fan community. With Wizards of the Coast's acquisition of D&D Beyond and their in-house development of their own VTT, it seems Wizards of the Coast are implementing my item number 3, which is basically to acquire and or develop online D2C resources. However, in my discussion of item number 3, I never mentioned to eliminate or cripple the competition. Given my lack of work experience in consumer products, I realistically was not expecting to be seriously considered for the position. However, after witnessing what Wizards of the Coast tried to do, I can confidently say I would have done a much better job than the people who are currently in charge. Thank you for watching. Sorry for my rants. Hope you found this video informative and entertaining. This is RPG Mods Fan saying cheers and have a good day.